Jeffrey DeHavilland designed his first viable aircraft around 1908-09, and it looked a good deal like the Wright Flyer of 1903. The DH-1 flew only 35 yards before breaking up. One would think that such an experience would have deterred DeHavilland, since he suffered some substantial injuries both to himself and to the plane. In any case, the DH-2 was much more successful, and in 1910 he was able to fly it on first try. DeHavilland was soon hired by the Royal Aircraft Factory, and his plane was purchased by the government for £400, about $800. In 1912, he went to work for Airco, the aircraft manufacturing company, and established a new design department. There were many innovations and improvements in the next few years, but the pusher design was held to be the only way to direct gunfire ahead of the plane, because the interrupter mechanism invented by the Frenchman Raymond Saulnier and refined by the Netherlander Anthony Fokker had not yet been perfected. The main drawback to the pusher configuration was the monosoupape rotary engine used on most of these planes. These engines turned with the propeller, and the crankshaft was affixed to the aircraft. When they got wound up a bit too tight, they tended to fling cylinders far and wide. This proved very destructive to the aircraft and anything else around, especially the propeller. The tractor configuration with the engine up front was less dangerous, since the cylinders didn't go tearing through the body of the plane, and the pilot was often able to get the craft on the ground in reasonably good condition. The first attempts to arm this plane was with the Lewis 303 machine gun. It was mounted on a telescoping pillar in front of the pilot to permit it to be fired in a sweeping motion in front of the plane. It was soon found that controlling this primitive craft and the gun at the same time was almost impossible. The first changes were made in the field by pilots and mechanics who flew and repaired the planes. For the most part, the guns were just affixed in place so the gun could be aimed along with the plane. Some had guns mounted on the side, but only a few were ever equipped with more than one gun. These planes were notorious for center of gravity problems. A quantity of lead had to be put in the nose section of the planes to keep them from standing on their tails at very inappropriate moments. This problem was never adequately corrected unless a very large pilot with a good deal of ammunition was up front. The first DH-2s were sent to the Western Front in July of 1915 and proved decidedly effective against the early German Albatros D-2 fighters. A newer model DH-2, built by the Royal Aircraft Factory, was sent to the front by February of 1916. It was quickly pressed into service just in time for the Battle of the Somme. It went a good way towards providing air supremacy over the Fokker E-3. Glenn Huff, award-winning builder of experimental and historic aircraft, started building his replica of the DH-2 in 1994 and worked on it intermittently for 6 years. He obtained some rudimentary plans from several sources, as well as a bit of information from the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Huff found all of these plans turned out to be the same thing. They were just old copies of the original drawings made for the War Board in London and were all dated 1914. All of the drawings were almost useless to him, as the construction materials and methods used in 1914 were almost entirely for wood. For the most part, he found the drawings could be best described as quaint and looked as if someone had just seated himself with pen and ink and made crude renderings of some ideas with no concept of how they were going to fit into the plane. But they did give him an overall dimension, and that is about where he quit using them. The FAA would never have approved this aircraft for flight if it had been constructed with the methods and materials used in 1914. Huff wanted a radial engine to make his DH-2 look more authentic and found a 160 horsepower Kenner engine down in Fort Worth. Log entry, January 10th through March 30th, 1997. Huff wrote, "After doing considerable work in mounting this engine, I found out that Mr. Kenner had never intended for his engines to run in a pusher configuration. The thrust bearings were not so arranged. Plan B. I next purchased an O320 Lycoming, 160 horsepower, and had the Sensenich folks make me a special prop for the project." The construction methods and materials he chose for his plane were of his own choosing, and, he said, should not be blamed on anyone else. The fuselage is a 4130 steel tubing, and the wings and landing gear are of 2024 T3 aluminum tubing, which he crushed to meet his needs. Huff says, "I just made up the airfoil, but it seems to work okay so far." This plane was inspected and improved for flight by the FAA on June 16, 2000. There have been a number of changes Huff made since he started flying it. Most of the changes were in trim control, as it proved to be sort of unruly in the air. The controls, he found, were quite heavy, but landing and ground handling characteristics were actually better than he expected. In preparing his DH-2 for its final home at the world-famous Liberty Memorial Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, Huff writes, "I have changed this plane somewhat before giving it to the museum. They requested that I make it more subdued in appearance, much as the originals were. For more information about this or other World War I aircraft made by Glenn Huff or other builders, please call or write Glenn Huff, 15932 Stillwell Road, Bonner Springs, Kansas, 66012. Phone 913-422-5920. Or learn more about historic aircraft in current day action by going to the website kcdawnpatrol.org. Click About Us.